Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this Greater Manchester Homelessness briefing. It's been a while since we gave you a full update on the position with a number of people sleeping rough, but also the wider efforts that are ongoing to support those people and tackle homelessness more generally. Really pleased to be doing a joint briefing today with the portfolio lead on housing and homelessness in Greater Manchester, the City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, and we are both thrilled to be joined by the Chief Executive of Mustard Tree, Joe Walby, who knows these issues as well, if not better than anyone else in Greater Manchester. And I wanted to start today by handing the floor over to Joe to let her just give you that very much frontline impression of this year, how it's been, and the pressure on organisations like Mustard Tree right now as we go into the winter. The purpose of today is to set out some new arrangements in Greater Manchester for the coming winter, which we all know is going to be extremely challenging for everybody. But before I get into those details, I am now going to pass over to Joe, and we're all really pleased, Joe, that you've been able to join us this afternoon.
You're just on mute, Joe.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. Yeah, absolute demand. We're one of thousands of charities across Greater Manchester that's been working with, as you know yourself, around a bed every night. What is clear is that the pandemic, as well as being a health issue, it's also been an economic crisis, and we have seen a big increase in demand of numbers of people coming in asking for help. And asking for help around housing and around general poverty. And the reality is, if people lose their job, they can't pay their rent, they will lose their tenancies, and that's absolutely what we've seen. So, for example, within Mustard Tree, we used to work with 500 people a month around providing emergency food, and that went to 1,000 people a week during the pandemic. So I think it's really clear that demand for emergency support such as ABEN is absolutely critical and will be critical during winter. And if I may, I'll just give you one example of this week. We had somebody that used to be a nurse that came into Mustard Tree for emergency support around food, and she'd left the NHS due to stress during the pandemic, and she was coming to us for a food parcel in tears, saying that this is the first time now that she's asking for help when normally she helps people. And so that's the reality of what we're seeing every day.
Thanks very much indeed, Joe. And if I could just ask us as well, if you could say something about your feeling about the winter, what you think is coming in our direction. Just a comment on organisations like yours. I mean, we are so indebted to you and all of your team for what you are doing, but we're also quite conscious that yourselves and other colleagues in the voluntary sector have been working at sort of full capacity all year, haven't you, without taking a breather? And obviously the sustainability of the situation is a real challenge for you, just from a kind of stress and pressure point of view, but also from a financial point of view. So it'd just be great, before Paul and I get into some of our policy announcements today, just, you know, how it feels sitting where you are right now and what you feel is coming both through Christmas and then into the new year.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really insightful question, because we are feeling there's like a tsunami of need that's going to come over January, February. It tends to be January, February that the homelessness in our experience. And I think the challenge really is around COVID means how do we deliver the support we need to do safely? And we can't just open up churches and just open up our buildings for people anymore. It needs to be single accommodation. How do we do that? How do we wrap support around that? When, as you say, not only is it that our people are tired and our volunteers are tired now, but it is also that the reality of finances and funding, either from local councils or funding from people themselves, you know, is obviously understandably going down. So it is a real pressure for that. And it is really only by joining in on things like ABEN, which we tried to do, which you did 3 years ago, about bringing together charities and churches and businesses and housing providers and health and police and local government. If we didn't have that, God help us, is what I'm saying, because really, if we didn't have the fact that we'd already developed some of those networks, I think we would be in a much, much worse situation.
Thanks so much, Jo. It's yeah, a relief that we do have those networks in place and organisations as good as yours. But what we now want to do is just turn our focus to the winter and how we're going to help organisations like Mustard Tree, but also people out there who need support through what will be a really difficult time. Just a reflection as well, if I may, on this year. I think it needs to be seen in two ways. Firstly, the quality of what we do has risen, as Jo was just saying, more single room provision, COVID secure provision. And I think that has helped turn a lot of lives around. You know, the quality and the dignity of that comes with providing single room provision to people obviously has a hugely beneficial impact, and that certainly has been a feature of this year. But actually, I think a story that isn't as told as much is just how demand has increased substantially, and the pressure is growing all of the while. And the way I would describe it right now is that Greater Manchester is in quite a precarious position. We are doing a lot and there's a lot of support there, but it's bearing a lot of weight, and we have real concerns about how sustainable the position is. So let me give you the current figures in terms of how many people are in a bed every night, ABEN. 480 will be in a bed every night tonight. Now, bear in mind, this is a scheme that didn't exist 2 years ago. It is now routinely running at that level every single night of the week. There's a second figure, which is what was called everyone in, and that was obviously rightly given great fanfare earlier in the year, but the funding is beginning to tail off for that. But nevertheless, there are an additional 480 people in what we would call the residual everyone in single room provision. So 960 people in forms of provision that didn't exist a couple of years ago. And that is obviously represents a massive effort on the part of our 10 councils and all of our voluntary organisations, but still, you know, it's bearing a lot of weight. And then add to that 3,600 individuals and mainly families in temporary accommodation, and that has increased by 20% this year. So when you look across those forms of emergency and temporary accommodation, you can see that around 4,500 people are in that form of provision, which is a really challenging situation, and we're doing our best to manage it. I was going to put one of our first slides up for you with regard to the position on rough sleeping, which you'll all know is the commitment that I made. According to a count that was carried out this week, the very latest position is that there are 115 people sleeping rough in Greater Manchester right now. I think the bar chart is up there for you, and the red line shows when a bed every night started, basically, and hopefully you can see clearly how it has made a real difference. That represents a 60% reduction in the number of people sleeping rough between 2017 and now. And so progress, but still that's 115 people too many who are out on the streets, cold streets, in the middle of a pandemic, which, you know, is not what we would want for anybody. So here's an announcement that we wanted to make today. The Combined Authority has just agreed to sign off an additional £600,000 for a bed every night. This comes from our own funding at a Greater Manchester level, not government funding. It is mayoral priorities funding. Some of it is to pay for the extra costs we've had to find to run a bed every night at the level we have this year. But the other part of the funding is to commission at least 40 additional places to expand a bed every night by 40. But you'll see the word minimum because we will also be supplementing that with extra spot provision as well. So it's quite a big commitment to expand our provision ahead of the winter. We will immediately be able to help more people the minute that those places have been stood up. So it's quite a significant commitment on our part, and obviously these places will be in place ahead of the winter. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things before handing over to Paul. You'll know that we've had existing schemes in place alongside a bed every night, notably our Housing First pilot. I wanted to give you the latest figures from that. Quite a big increase this year in the numbers of people being referred into Housing First, and the very latest figure is that there are 171 people with tenancies under Housing First. And one of the really excellent statistics underneath that is that 88% of tenancies under Housing First are being sustained for longer than 6 months. And I think that says something about the quality of what our partners delivering Housing First are doing. So a big thank you from me and Paul to all of them. Housing First is already making a very big difference and providing some of that move on accommodation that is so desperately needed, currently, of which we don't have anywhere near enough. But Paul will say a little about that in a moment. Alongside the Housing First programme, we have set up in the last 18 months an ethical lettings agency called Let Us, which is a partnership amongst our housing providers. And in the name, Let Us, it does what it says. It's asking private landlords to hand over the running of and the letting of their properties to the agency, and then those properties from the private rented sector can then be operated on a more social rent philosophy. And the latest figures there are 650 properties are part of the ethical lettings agency, and around 50 have been made available to people who have been homeless. So real progress there as well. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, but I guess the summary of all of this, and it goes back to what Joe said at the beginning, is that without the work that Greater Manchester has done in the last 3 years through the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network, bringing together this strong partnership between voluntary, public, faith sectors and the private sector, without a bed every night, without Housing First, we would really be in a very, very different position today, given the pressure that is coming at our system right now. So, we are pleased to be able to announce this uplift today to bed every night. It will make a difference, but of course, longer term solutions are needed. And with that, I'm going to hand over to the City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett, who will talk to you about the move on accommodation that will be coming through, some of the challenges that the government will be posing for us if they don't change some of the policies that they have. And then I'm going to finish by saying a little about prevention and a youth prevention pilot we're launching today, as well as an appeal through our 1GM initiative, which we are going to need backing from the tremendous Greater Manchester public. But I'm going to pause there for now and hand over to the City Mayor of Salford, Paul Dennett.
Thank you very much, Mayor Burnham. And as you rightly highlighted, the situation in Greater Manchester and up and down the country in many respects when it comes to tackling homelessness and rough sleeping and the housing crisis is very much precarious. And this is a crisis that had manifested itself before, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic had hit this country, and it was a crisis that national government obviously acknowledged in their white paper. But colleagues will be aware that today we've taken 3 papers to the combined authority to update on the latest position around homelessness in the context of COVID-19, and also to highlight some of our preparedness in terms of the second wave, and also preparation that's underway for the next financial year. Mayor Burnham's already touched on the Young Persons Homelessness Prevention Pathfinder, which we've announced today at the Combined Authority, and I'll touch on a little bit more detail around the rough sleeper accommodation programme. But I have to say, you know, it's real tribute to the collective effort in Greater Manchester why we are where we are at this point in time. And, you know, Joe's already highlighted that, and I'd like to place on record my thanks and appreciation for everyone who's working across the city region to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, and also the housing crisis as we move forward. This is the third year in a row we've seen an annual decrease in obviously the official annual rough sleep account. Obviously these numbers need to be verified by the department. I think that happens in February. And as you've already highlighted, a 40-bed expansion of your initiative and a bed every night, obviously continuing to focus on those individuals with complex needs and the most vulnerable within our city region. And, you know, I'm pleased to announce that part of this expansion is also providing accommodation and support for those with dogs who are sleeping rough within Greater Manchester, which has been, you know, one of the ongoing challenges of the system to date. And obviously we're continuing to provide accommodation in a COVID-19 compliant way, and ensuring that we've got a collectively agreed set of standards around this has been really, really important, certainly around our rigorous infection prevention and control measures moving forward. And also we're continuing to work with the Health and Social Care Partnership and the Department for Health and Social Care, as you've probably seen from the papers, around COVID-19 care provision for people at risk of being homeless. And you've already highlighted the £663,000 investment into a young person's homelessness prevention pathfinder. That is to support between 250 and 300 under 35s, mainly 18 to 25s within Greater Manchester, who are at risk of becoming homeless. And as you've rightly highlighted, we've also been successful in Greater Manchester with the rough sleeper accommodation programme. Not only has the Combined Authority been successful, but also local authorities across Greater Manchester have been successful in accessing capital and revenue to provide 150 sources of accommodation to help tackle the homelessness and housing crisis in Greater Manchester. This has very much been a partnership between our 10 local authorities, housing associations, the Ethical Lettings Agency, and also the social impact investment company Resonance within Greater Manchester. We've been successful with £3.5 million from government to procure 60 properties. This is in many respects a unique capital opportunity. These opportunities don't come along that often, and what we'll be deploying is 2.76 million to procure those 60 properties. There is some revenue support funding with this, so for the 20 units that will sit with housing associations, there's some revenue funding of £262,000, and for those 40 units that sit outside of housing associations, working with Resonance and the ELA and private rented tenancies, always said in terms of tackling housing and homelessness crisis, this is also about service provision as well as a home, and housing first in many respects, as colleagues will know, speaks to that. In addition to that, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the ongoing challenges we're facing here within Greater Manchester. And I want to just dwell a little bit on the wider determinants of homelessness and the importance, if you like, of our forthcoming prevention agenda, which we hope to publish in March of next year. What do we mean by, you know, the wider determinants of housing and homelessness? Well, this is about genuinely affordable housing and the scarcity of social housing. You know, over 95,000 homes have been purchased under right to buy in Greater Manchester since 1980. 40% of those we know nationally find their way into the private sector, and many of those homes are not replenished, diminishing the social and council housing stock Greater Manchester. Also, we're talking about those with no recourse to public funds and the absolute necessity to support them. And obviously, we've been doing that through Bed Every Night. We're also talking about welfare here, and we've been very clear in Greater Manchester that government should scrap the benefit cap, because we know that as a consequence of that, it's who are genuinely struggling to decide between heating and eating their homes, and obviously paying the rent in addition to that. We also know that government have recently announced, as part of the spending review, their intentions to not continue with the universal credit uplift in the next financial year, which is deeply, deeply disappointing. That has been a lifeline for many families within Greater Manchester, and all that will do is push more people into poverty and debt, and push more people into struggling to actually pay those housing costs and ensure that they've got enough money to make ends meet. I think what was also quite concerning as well in the spending review announcement was the Chancellor confirming that the local housing allowance will actually be frozen for 2021-22, and therefore it will be decoupled from median rents. Now, this is a huge challenge for us here in Greater Manchester, because we know one of the challenges of the system at the moment is finding suitable move-on accommodation. And if that local housing allowance isn't uplifted, it makes it all the more difficult to actually access homes in the private rented sector moving forward. So again, I think we all need to continue to lobby and campaign on that issue. But I mean, beyond that, what we really need to do is start building truly affordable housing. And obviously the National Planning Policy Framework nationally doesn't support us in this, because in a sense it prioritises profit for developers and profit for landowners over genuinely building truly affordable housing. And time again, when planning applications are considered at the 10 local authorities across Greater Manchester, it's affordable homes that are often hit when it comes to those viability assessments and those Section 106 or community infrastructure assessments undertaken. So these are some of the structural challenges, and we'll need to continue to lobby and campaign in this space. But I think when you look at the achievements to date, certainly over the last 3 years, I think everyone in Greater Manchester should be proud of their commitment and their efforts here to trying to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. It is still a precarious environment within which we find ourselves, and we must continue to collectively work together, really, to continue to rise to the challenge of this system. But I just want to say thanks to everyone who's supported us thus far. Thank you, Mayor Burnham.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul, and thank you for all of your work to bring us to this point. I'm really pleased to say we've been joined by the Reverend Ian Rutherford, who is chair of our Homelessness Action Network. And Ian, could I just invite you to say a couple of words about the position as you see it right now, what you're seeing out there, and your feelings about the winter ahead of us?
Yes, of course, Andy. Thank you very
thanks,
much.
Ian.
Obviously, as far as a Bed Every Night is concerned, that was really co-designed with the Homelessness Action Network to provide that welcome into a safe space, food provision, proper bed, opportunity to discuss the individual's needs and the next moves. And the good outcomes that we've seen over these last 3 years are the big levels of positive move-ons in relation to that. As far as I'm concerned, a Bed Every Night always gives people the chance to settle, to feel confident, to receive support, and to have the agency to move to the next part of their journey away from the streets. And so therefore to be able to announce that we're adding another 40 beds, so a minimum of 520 over the GM situation over this winter is a massive move on our part. But we've obviously seen some really big changes over these last 3 years. We've been committed as a network to 4 elements: reduction, respite, recovery and reconnection. And when we say reduction, we're really talking about working on prevention, dealing with some of the causes of homelessness upstream. And that Youth Homelessness Pathfinder that we're announcing today covers that age group 18 to 35. When we did a Bed Every Night in that first phase, 54% of those who came and were helped were actually in in that age group. So it's so important that in those areas of Manchester and Salford and Bolton where we're going to be starting this Pathfinder, we really work with some of those issues that cause homelessness and do that prevention work. Obviously, any data and any outcomes that we get from the evaluation of that will help us to frame a long-term social outcome contract across the 10 boroughs so that this particular group of those between 18 and 35 are really helped. I'm really proud to be able to speak also as a trustee of the Greater Manchester Mayor's Charity. You know, as far as I'm concerned, we have a reputation in Greater Manchester for helping each other out. This is a city region that cares. And as a charity, we are looking to bring help to the most vulnerable in our society. We've provided help and funding for A Bed Every Night, especially in relation to those who have got no recourse to public funds. And we've also supported the VCSE sector and faith sector with their core costs in that emergency period, March to June. After that, we funded innovative solutions to help people experiencing homelessness as we move into the recovery period now. We're the ones that are administering the COVID and the 1GM funds to help those most affected by the COVID emergency. So we stand ready as a charity to be able to help in this respect. So from my point of view, always it's a case of saying this is a cross-sector approach. The whole society within Greater Manchester has come together to make the difference that we've seen. The figures that we've got of the reduced number of people rough sleeping, all those folks that we helped during the emergency period, and now being able to stand up 520 beds over this winter just mean that we are ready to help and we're ready to care.
Thanks so much, Ian. My goodness, you're ready to help. Well, you already have helped so much. You, Joe, the entire Homelessness Action Network, where we would be without you, I genuinely don't know, and I can't thank you all enough. And it is actually wonderful to see the faith sector in all of its diversity coming forward to help. Churches, mosques, synagogues, you name it, they're all there supporting us too. Gurdwaras, you know, there's so much going on in all of our faith communities, and it means a great deal. I've just got two final announcements, colleagues, before we open up to your questions. One is to alert you to another proposal that went through the combined authority today, and this is to establish a young person's homelessness prevention pathfinder. This is an innovative piece of work through our public service reform funding that is initially around £650,000 worth of investment. This will be to get upstream and to put in place mediation and support for young people who are identified at being at risk of homelessness. And we're quite excited actually about both focus on young people, but also beginning to understand those reasons why people start to fall through the cracks and through the net and end up on the streets, particularly young people. And it supplements the work we're doing with our care leavers. We've just committed this year to provide free bus travel to our young people leaving care up to the age of 21. But obviously this scheme will go into a much more in-depth look at how we prevent homelessness amongst our young people. It will be a stepping stone towards a Greater Manchester homelessness prevention strategy. The Homelessness Programme Board that Joe and Ian are both on has taken a decision to bring forward a comprehensive strategy to prevent homelessness in Greater Manchester, and that work is in development at the moment. If re-elected next year, that strategy will be centre stage in terms of my plans to both continue the emergency support that we have, but then, as I say, get beyond that and look towards more long-term, durable solutions, particularly looking at this issue of families in temporary accommodation, which hasn't had the attention that it deserves hitherto. And we have a piece of work going on about how we raise standards for families in that position, how we protect the safety of the children in that position, and that will be a big part of our work, as well as adopting a different approach to healthcare for people who are sleeping rough or who have been and who are homeless as part of an inclusion health approach. So exciting developments, and we will say more about that in due course. The last thing to say is, of course, we're putting a lot of investment forward here. We're expanding a bed every night today, but it's not necessarily going to be easy to meet all of this through public funds. We have got voluntary organisations that are struggling as well. So I'm going to finish today with an appeal. I think a slide will come up, which is about supporting all of our work through the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity. Now, you'll know that there is a route to fund a bed every night through the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity. And I would say to the incredible public of Greater Manchester, the best thing to do this year is to funnel the support you've got for people sleeping rough through the charity, so that we can expand those places in a bed every night even further, possibly, and help more people. Obviously, it's all free. People do not have to pay to have a room through a bed every night. And we would encourage people, rather than to give on the street, to give through the Greater Manchester Mayor's charity, so we can put in place proper support for people that will make a difference. Linked to that is the 1GM campaign, which is a discrete funding stream within the Mayor's charity. This is to create a hardship fund that will provide the essentials to people this year through a difficult winter. So people who are homeless, but others too, in terms of the basics that they will need week in, week out. So just to make that final appeal to people that we are going to need to call on your generosity to help us through this winter, which promises to be one of the most difficult we've experienced, possibly in our lifetimes. So that's it from the presentations and the announcements. Jimmy, I'm going to hand back to you to take us through any questions. But in closing, just a thank you to you, Ian, for being with us, and to you, Joe, and to Paul for all of your excellent work on this. Jimmy.
Thank you, Andy. So initially a question for yourself and for Paul, and then perhaps also Joe. And this is a question from Liam Gotting at Heart Radio at 1:36. And Liam asks, how much of an impact has the pandemic had on rough sleeping figures? How vital have hotels and bed and breakfasts been in giving people somewhere to go? So maybe Andy first, and then Paul, and then Joe.
Thank you, Liam. Well, I think it's had a massive impact on the numbers. Joe touched on it. I gave you the figures for people in a bed every night, everyone in, and temporary accommodation. So if you add all of that together, it's getting on for 5,000 people. You know, this demand is outstripping anything we've seen before in terms of the numbers being supported. Temporary accommodation have been increasing in recent years, but of course this 20% uplift this year is a bigger increase than and it's led to the biggest number that we've seen for some considerable time. So it's clearly the case that the lockdowns create breakdown in terms of people's housing arrangements. We saw that earlier this year, and more likely than not, the same thing has been happening over the last month. People who have casual arrangements, sofa surfing or whatever it might be, can find that those arrangements end once we go into a lockdown situation. So the pandemic has had a massive effect on increasing the number of people seeking support. The hotels and B&Bs, they've just been invaluable. I think it's hard to even put a price on it. You know, where would we have been without them? Because you cannot operate dormitory provision at this time. So bed every night's not operating in that way. And obviously with everyone in, we made single rooms available, and you know, without the support from hotels and B&Bs, we just simply wouldn't have been able to look after those people. So thank you to the providers in the hotel world for working with us. And as I've described it, Liam, this is a precarious position going into the winter. There is provision there. We've created a little extra slack today with the 40 minimum extra places being brought into bed every night ahead of the winter. But I would not want to kid anybody in saying that this is going to be easy. It's not. We have a very tough winter ahead of us.
Thanks. Do you want me to just say a couple of words on that, Andy?
Please,
yeah.
No, absolutely, Paul.
That's fine, yeah. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's had a huge impact, COVID-19, on homelessness and rough sleeping, and we've already shared the figures. I think it's 3,600 households at the moment in temporary accommodation across our 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester. That's an increase of 20%, and over 2,000 of those households are families with children. So you get to really understand the impact here. It's significant, and I understand it's just under 1,000 people who've been supported now through Bed Every Night, and obviously the legacy of everyone in accommodation. And as you've rightly highlighted, hotels and bed and breakfast played an invaluable and critical role really in helping us meet the requirements of government to move everyone in at that point in time during the pandemic. But as you've rightly highlighted, this is a precarious situation, and at the moment we're all trying to properly understand obviously the impact of COVID-19 on our economy, and certainly some of the indicative data that's being shared with us, and obviously there's a lag in terms of this data from a real-time point of view, is suggesting rising unemployment and rising reliance on universal credit and welfare benefits, which again creates a real precarious situation moving forward, especially when you realise that the government aren't going to be increasing local housing allowance in the next financial year, and therefore our ability to access private rented sector accommodation is diminished further. And also at the moment we have around 100,000 households on our housing waiting lists across Greater Manchester. Again, another indication of the precariousness of the situation here moving forward. So lots more to be done, but I do think hotels and B&Bs have played an invaluable role, and COVID-19 has had an impact on homelessness and rough sleeping, but it will continue to have an impact as we start to properly understand the economic impact of COVID-19 moving forward. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Paul. Jimmy?
Sorry, just to add to that, I would say everything that they've said, but also what we're seeing is that if you can't pay rent, then you've got the risk of losing your home. And we're seeing more people coming into us that have issues around finances and around debt and around, we're using some of our hardship fund for the first time to help pay rent arrears to try and keep people into accommodation. So as we've said before, and has been said before, it's the economic issue of COVID that is really, really driving the sort of level of anxiety that we're feeling at the moment. One other thing I would say about hotels and B&Bs, they have, I think, given the essential lifeline of one individual rooms, but they would not have been successful without the hundreds of volunteers and the people that have gone in to provide food or gone in to provide support or just a listening ear to those people in hotels. And that's down to those volunteers, hundreds of volunteers, both in charities and outside of charities, that have just supported those hotels and those B&Bs to try and provide some comfort to people. So it's a massive, massive thank you to those individuals and those volunteers as well.
Thank you, Joe. Two connected questions. These are for Andy and Paul. The first is from Nigel Barlow at 144 from About Manchester. To Andy and Paul, how do you feel that the pandemic has impinged on your goals on homelessness in the medium term? And then Eloise Linford from Hits Radio at 126 asks of you, Andy, at the end of 2020, there are still people sleeping rough in Manchester. Even without the pandemic, do you think it was ever achievable to completely end rough sleeping by this point? So perhaps you first, Andy, and then Paul.
Thanks, Jimmy. So Eloise, that's a really good question, and let me take your question first, because I think you're alluding to the commitment I made to end rough sleeping by 2020. I think I need to say again at this point that it was always a call to arms to try and galvanise the whole of the GM system to get everybody thinking differently about what might be achievable. So, I have no regrets at all about making that commitment, and I think it absolutely was possible to get right down. And I think if you look at the bar chart that we put up earlier, I don't know if it can be shown again. I think at the rate this time last year, we were beginning to make real headway, I think, in terms of a person by person approach to creating new solutions for people. We were very much, myself and the head of my office, who did some fantastic work on this, really working hard to get underneath the problem. And if the rate of increase 2018 to 19 had continued this year, I think we would have been down into double figures, and I would have hoped lowish double figures. That's what we were working towards, Eloise. And that, you know, people then could have argued, had I met the commitment or not, or was it enough or not? But I think that's where we were heading. But obviously, I don't want to use the pandemic as an excuse. I mean, it has created, it's changed everything. Of course it has, and the level of demand that we're now trying to cope with is enormous. But I think Joe said it before. You know, where would we be without that provision? The fact that we have reduced rough sleeping again in the middle of a pandemic, I think says something about the strength of our partnerships in Greater Manchester, the quality of our provision that we have now. I think that's a huge achievement, to be honest. So the world has changed this year, but I'm not backing away from the commitment that I made. I think we could have got it much lower and right down, actually, given the progress we were beginning to make this time last year. That's been interrupted, but even with that, we've still seen a pretty significant reduction year on year between 2019 and 2020. So don't want to give you a politician's answer. Was it ever fully achievable? I think it would always been a real struggle, because obviously there may be always some people who choose not to come inside. There is the issue of people with no recourse to public funds that Paul mentioned. You know, the government, under government policy, you can't end rough sleeping, because they would say you can't help some people. You're prevented from helping some people. So we've had to raise voluntary funds to help people in that position. So I'm incredibly proud of what's been achieved. Once we're through this, I will renew the commitment to end rough sleeping, because I think that's what we should do. That's what Greater Manchester should be about. Nobody out on the streets. That's the kind of place I want us to be. And although it's now going to be a little delayed because of the pandemic, I will still reset that mission coming out of all of this, and learning from all of this in terms of how if you provide better quality to people, you can actually achieve more for people and turn more lives around. So I think that maybe answers your question too, Nigel. It is a sort of fairly major interruption, if you like, into in the path that we were on, the trajectory that we were on, but we've still managed to make progress.
Thank you, Paul. Is there anything you'd like to add? You're currently on mute, Paul. You're on mute, Paul.
Sorry, thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, no, I would agree with everything Andy said. I think undoubtedly the pandemic has had an impact on how we operationalise our mission to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping within Greater Manchester. But as Andy said, it's always been a call to arms, hasn't it? It's about the whole of the Greater Manchester family working together to tackle what is, in many respects, a humanitarian crisis in this country. And, for me, it's always been morally and ethically the right thing to do. Having a roof over your head is a human right, in my opinion, and I think we're all motivated by that. And Andy's absolutely right to make this his number one political and policy priority within the combined authority. And witnessing the call to arms in terms of the last 3 years has been great to see. And I just want to pay thanks to everyone involved in this. But just to give you an idea of the impact of COVID-19, so for example now we can't really use night shelters as a consequence of the information, advice and guidance coming from Public Health England, because our accommodation moving forward has to be COVID-19 secure. And also we need to make sure we put in place additional measures around infection prevention for people at risk of homeless or sleeping rough on our streets, and also control measures around all of that. So inevitably this has created a different model, and the speed with which the system has moved here in Greater Manchester has been phenomenal. Again, it's another form of that call to arms delivering across Greater Manchester. But as we've highlighted on the call today, You know, the situation is still very precarious. We don't fully appreciate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic economically. We are seeing rising unemployment, rising reliance on benefits, and you know how this now manifests itself over the next few years is going to have a further impact on homelessness and rough sleeping, and we need to be prepared as a system to tackle that. Also, the indications around temporary accommodation, you know, a 20% increase, all point to the precarity of the system we face at the moment. But I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, and we shouldn't apologise for, you know, what we've achieved to date, but there's more to build on, and there's certainly more coming down the line in terms of the challenges for the future in Greater Manchester. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And Joe, would you like to add something?
Yes, what I think I'd just like to add is absolutely, we need to change our world. The level of inequality across this country is not acceptable. And it is very, very hard to say what would happen if ABEN wasn't in place. It's hard to prove a negative. What I can say is that we have more space, more beds, more offerings, more opportunities for people now to try and get out of this horrific situation because of ABEN, and more importantly because of the leadership I think that has been shown about, and the statement made that that level of inequality is not acceptable. Homelessness is the tip of the iceberg, so people on the streets the tip of the iceberg. It's the wider issues that unfortunately does involve us working with politicians. No offence to the politicians on the call, but it is a policy and political issue as well as a pragmatic issue in terms of people coming into charities, and the only way we're going to change it is by seeing the leadership that is being led by Andy, by Paul, to actually say we've got to change some of these systemic issues, make housing affordable, address the fact that council cuts means there are less services for drug and alcohol people, there are less services for care leavers, and that's what we're seeing on our streets now. It's connected, unfortunately. So to answer the question, we absolutely have to set that objective of getting rid of rough sleeping. We've got to set that objective. We've got to be passionate about addressing that. And COVID has given us a shock. It's given us an opportunity as well in terms of trying to do things differently. But we've got to be ambitious to address this, because what is the alternative if we're not? And I think Greater Manchester is lucky actually that we have got those leaders there.
Thank you, Joe. So a question now for Andy, and then possibly Ian, and then Joe again. And this is from Jacqueline at Radio Manchester, who asks at 137, who asks, can Andy say anything more about the number of families in temporary accommodation? What is behind these numbers going up? And what sort of waiting timescales are they facing to find permanent accommodation? So Andy, and then Ian and Joe, if they'd like to speak to families in temporary accommodation.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I mean, it's such an important question, and to be honest, I don't think there's a simplistic answer to the issue of the numbers. It's linked to the financial pressures people are under this year. So we've been talking about it a lot, haven't we? People on furlough, people excluded from public support. Hundreds of thousands of people in Greater Manchester have received nothing at all. People who are freelancers or people who are newly self-employed. As we know, they've been left completely out in the cold. So that's one driver of family arrangements breaking down and people not being able to afford their rent and going into arrears. There's the whole question of relationship breakdown. It's obviously White Ribbon, White Ribbon Day this week. We've got ours on today, recognising that there is an issue this year around domestic abuse and violence. Obviously, the White Ribbon is a statement that that is never acceptable in any circumstances, and it should never go unchallenged, or people should never go silent about it. But the reality is it's more of an issue this year, and there's been breakdown of people's family arrangements. Lockdown, as I said before, causes the breakdown of housing arrangements if they are a sort of casual or a temporary or insecure arrangement. So, you know, it's not easy, is it, to put one cause on it. What we do know is the pressure is building all of the while. And, you know, just a reflection on the debate about the tiers, you know, I have no regrets about saying to the government, it was wrong to try and pay people a 67% furlough. It was wrong to try and lock down people's businesses without providing any support for those who are self-employed. It was wrong to put Greater Manchester into restrictions for 3 months without giving us any support at all. And only when London went in tier 2 did the whole issue of support for tier 2 come on the table. Those things were wrong. And you can't lock people down without providing proper support. And, you know, I think we're dealing with some of the consequences of locking down without looking after everybody, particularly those 3 million excluded. So, you know, councils are under massive pressure here. They're struggling to find those places. And I think, as Paul was saying before, we're going back to a world now where the government are now proposing to freeze the local housing allowance come next April. That is such a backward step and a contradictory step when in the other breath they're promising to support rough sleeping. I mean, how about preventing rough sleeping rather than supporting it when people are in that position? Because what we saw in the table that you saw before, the increase in rough sleeping in Greater Manchester through 2014, 15, 16, 17, that was very significantly affected by a freeze to local housing allowance. And sadly, with this wrong policy choice by the Chancellor, we may well be back in that position come the new year. We feel we need to give more focus to the whole issue of temporary accommodation, particularly the safety of children in those arrangements, their ability to maintain relationships with school, areas they may have left their friends. So we have had a task and finish group under the Homelessness Programme Board looking at this whole question. And as I said, that will be a bigger priority for us going forward. So I hope that answers the question, Jacqueline. I don't know if Ian or Joe would like to add anything to that.
Yeah.
You've gone off again, Ian. I don't know if we're having trouble with your microphone there. Ian, do you want to try again?
Yes, Andy, sorry about that. We've done that work within the programme board in relation to homeless families, which I think is now starting to bear real fruit. We heard stories from those who had been suffering from some difficulties. Maybe it was domestic violence, maybe it was violence of a neighbour, some economic reasons why they were coming into temporary bed and breakfast. And having that story brought to us has really got us moving into organising ourselves into a much stronger web of support from obviously from local authorities, but also from health, from children's services, from education, from faith sector, from voluntary sector, making sure that within each of the boroughs of Greater Manchester, we know what sort of support is available to a family that is finding itself within a temporary accommodation. But beyond that, we've also seen the local authorities refresh the bed and breakfast framework, having heard those stories, having heard some of the issues. It's a much stronger framework now, and it's a much safer place for people to be. And this work continuing, of course, as you mentioned earlier, Andy, about inclusion health, bringing that into the mix so that we're all taking responsibility for the health of our children and the health of our families. So I think that work will start to bear fruit in this next year. But they were maybe hidden homeless. They're not hidden now. We're really working hard to bring that support together.
See him.
I think the only other thing I would add is that, which I'm sure everyone shares, is that almost the shame really that you've got so many children now and families that are in this situation, and that's what I think drives me and I'm sure colleagues to just keep fighting as hard as we can to change this situation. And it isn't one reason why I don't think there's not one reason why. So I think the only other thing I would add to it is it makes sense to look at joining stuff up. So one of the things that Andy did was set up a reform board where people from different sectors, whether that's charities or schools, or come and actually talk about some of these challenges. And then also set up a scheme to focus on young people and focus on early start, making the the early start for residents across Greater Manchester to be better and to shine a spotlight on that. And I think it's really only by linking up these sorts of initiatives, so that we don't just look at homelessness being rough sleepers. We do actually understand that, you know, children in temporary accommodation have less chance of success at school and those sorts of things. It's only by linking that together and understanding that and making sure that our politicians hear case stories, hear studies, hear examples of what the reality is for those people and those families, so that they can try and influence change. But the frustration and what I don't understand is how, on the one hand, you have a government that will give sort of homeless funding out, but at the same time will ask councils to cut hundreds of millions of pounds on their core services, when those councils provide services for us as people to support those families if they're in need, or to support provide health visitors for homeless families. So I think what I would just say to that question really is, I think that it is what I think the focus needs to be on, is about those people that are in temporary accommodation, to provide options and chances for those people to move out of that into permanent accommodation. And I am confident that that is going to be addressed and focused as an issue moving forward out of the pandemic.
Thanks for bringing me in on this, Jimmy. I really appreciate that. I think this is a really good question, and I mean, colleagues are absolutely right. The answer is very complex in many respects. But if we look at history on this issue, you know, post World War II, when councils up and down the country were building council housing en masse, homelessness in this country was rendered statistically insignificant. So the supply of truly affordable housing has to sit at the heart of this answer, really, to this complex issue. Also, you know, right to buy, we know we're losing accommodation under right to buy that isn't being replaced, and we know nationally that 40% of that finds its way into the private rented sector. We need to pause right to buy or scrap right to buy altogether, similar to what places like Scotland have done. Also, it was very sad to see in the Chancellor's spending review the other day his intentions to encourage councils to pay for services by increasing council tax by a further 5%. And I say that because I thought the government thought decisions on taxation was something for the future as we engage in economic stimulus post COVID-19 pandemic. Council tax is a regressive tax. All it does is push some of the poorest into society into further poverty. So there's a huge issue there, and I think we need a conversation about how we actually formulate taxation moving forward, and where we tax and where we don't tax. Clearly, the universal credit reforms are deeply disappointing. The fact that that uplift isn't going to be maintained into the next financial year is only going to put more families into destitution and poverty. We've already heard from Andy around the freezing of the local housing allowance next year and there not being a link now to median rents. We've talked about scrapping the benefit cap. But I think importantly for us as well, and Joe touched on this, you know, the impact of austerity going into the COVID-19 pandemic shouldn't be underestimated in terms of the problems we see today. You know, the cutting of funding for substance misuse, the cutting of funding for mental health services, the fact that welfare rights and debt advice services in local councils is a non-statutory service. Therefore, we receive no money from central government to fund those really important services. And also the cutting of funding around domestic violence and abuse. You know, all of these things together are very much the reason why, in my opinion, I think we're seeing a rising in terms of homelessness presentations, but also a rising in terms of, you know, temporary accommodation being utilised at this point in time. It is a complex answer, but I can't help but reflect on the past. You know, part of the solution here has to be about properly funding council services and getting back to building council housing again. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We're overrunning slightly. We can keep going, I think, till about 15:15, and we have 3 questions to go. So the first actually is back with you, Paul, before then Andy comes in, and it's from Joshy Herman at the Mill at 1:25, Paul. In the recent BBC documentary Mantopia, there was some suggestion that the building boom in the centre of Manchester and in Salford is pushing homeless people out of the city centre because the shelters and other provisions are losing their places. Is this a concern, and what can you do to make sure that homeless people who prefer being in the city centre can get some provision there? It comes to you, Paul, only because you mentioned Salford, and then perhaps Andy. You're back on mute, Paul.
Thanks, Jimmy. No, this is a good question. Clearly, we've seen significant growth and economic development and regeneration in Greater Manchester over recent years, and that's helped local authorities in terms of bringing in the council tax and the business rates to provide much needed services, especially in a context of austerity and cuts, which have been manifesting themselves for 10 years. But there's no doubt about it, you know, the economic boom we've seen has manifested itself in terms of rising property prices and rising land prices. And as a consequence of that, you know, things happen where that actually happens in the city region. For me, it's about working with local authorities to make sure there is service provision where it needs to be in the city region. And I know all 10 local authorities are very much committed to that agenda. It's also about a strong working relationship with obviously our community and voluntary sector. And Joe's on the call from the Mustard Tree. The Mustard Tree, as we know, is located in the heart of the city centre, providing much needed services to people at risk of homeless and also people sleeping rough on our streets. But, you know, that having said that, you know, I am obviously concerned about the ongoing drift here in terms of rising property prices and rising land prices, and then what implications that has for how we deliver and fund services moving forward. It is something we need to keep a watching brief on, undoubtedly. But I think where we're at the moment in Greater Manchester, I think, you know, we should be quite proud for the relationship between councils and the community and voluntary sector, and also the collaborative working across the city region, not just in the city centre, to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. But as I've already said, you know, the key solution to this is, in my opinion, councils playing a much more interventionist role within the housing market, not taking a hands-off approach and leaving it to private developers and landowners, but actually starting to build truly affordable council housing again. And that's something certainly I've been looking at in the city of Salford, and watch this space for developments coming forward in the near future to hopefully demonstrate the City Council's commitment to using its borrowing powers and its land assets to actually drive an agenda here to genuinely tackle the housing crisis. Thanks, Jimmy.
So, Joshy, thanks for the question. I'm going to kind of come back a bit strong on this one. I think the programme Mantopia had a bit of an agenda to sort of portray things in a certain way. And yes, there was definitely an issue with LifeShare. I mean, they've been in a premises for a long time, and that was changing, and we struggled. We tried to help them find an alternative place, but to kind of portray it as the whole thing that everyone was being driven out because it was all being gentrified. As ever, there's some truth in that, but in no way does that tell the whole story of what's been going on here in the last few years. As the figures we put to you today would tell you, we've created many more places for people to go, both in the outer boroughs, but also within the city centre and in and around Manchester and Salford. We've helped organisations like Coffee for Craig, and they've relocated, because sometimes voluntary organisations have to relocate. So, you know, the idea that everyone's being driven out and all the shelters are losing their spaces, of course it's a concern, because from time to time, as the city changes, somebody has been in a base and they'll have to move to a different base. But to kind of portray it as though it's this callous sort of pushing everyone out, well, no, that isn't what's been going on. And actually, we've been opening many more places over the last couple of years, so that people can still get provision within the city centre, so in and around the city centres. So, you know, like all good programmes, they had a kind of a story to tell, but I don't think it reflected everything that's been going on in Greater Manchester in the last 3 years.
Thank you, Andy. And we're into the final question, and this one is for Ian, and then Joe, and then perhaps Andy, if you'd like to wrap up. This is from Joshy again at the Mill at 210. Have there been any changes in the kinds of people who have been using your services in the past 6 months? And can you give us a sense of that change, please?
I think I would just tell the story that when I come into Manchester to my church on Oldham Street, I come into Piccadilly Station and walk up that 7-minute walk up to Oldham Street at Piccadilly Gardens there. And there'll be some folks that will be on the side of the street that will be needing to have some help, and I'll pop across and have a word with them all. When I've spoken to them recently, they've been telling me that they've just come onto the street. There's been a problem with furlough. There's been a loss of a job that didn't quite work out. There's been a breakdown in a relationship. These are folks that have just come onto the streets within the last week, within the last month. It's economic that's causing this situation. And so from that point of view, there's a real need to be alongside those folks in order to bring them to the next part of their journey away from the streets. That's why a bed every night is such a powerful thing, because it enables that time, that space to be able to have that conversation, to understand exactly what is needed, to be able to move further away from the streets and into more permanent accommodation. So I think we've seen a difference of the folks that are there. These are not entrenched people on the street. These are newly homeless, and they need some really strong help, emergency provision from a bed every night, and then that move on into a positive place where they can come back into community and be reconnected.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. It used to be relationship breakdown, I think, was the #1 cause of homelessness. And I think what we are definitely seeing at Mustard Tree, and certainly other colleagues in the voluntary sector and charity sector, is there's a much wider conversation to do with both debt now, financial issues, and losing tenancies because of that. I think there are more options, ironically, for people who are recently homeless to try and get into things like ABEN now. But I think people that are entrenched in rough sleeping have more complexity around addiction services, around addiction issues or a care leavers. And I do think that there is a correlation between lack of support available for people to get help earlier and to the people that are entrenched in rough sleeping. So I just echo that it's economic and financial is definitely what we're seeing.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Joe. Jimmy, shall I wrap up at this point? Is there no other questions to answer?
That's right, Andy. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Joshy, I think Joe and Ian are much better placed to answer this question than I am, and I think they've given you their thoughts. I mean, I just want to sort of finish by saying how proud I am really to work within a Greater Manchester system that has just kind of shown so much commitment and passion and kind of will to change things over the last couple of years. And it's been really kind of long journey, tough journey in many ways, with lots of ups and downs. But it's so much improved what we're doing today than it was a few years ago. And I need to pay tribute to Paul, because Paul has led that work superbly, and his own council Salford is just an absolute model of best practice, I think, in terms of how to deal with many of these issues. So he leads by example in his own area, and it's fantastic what Paul and his team have achieved. I mean, I just want to praise all of the councils too, though. Obviously, Manchester City Council have been a huge partner with us, and they deal with so much pressure that is way beyond what most others have to contend with. All of the other aids have been bought into what we've been trying to do with all of the voluntary organisations within their borough. So, in some ways, we're skating over things today, and easy words, and what lies beneath this is just so much kind of human generosity, commitment, decency of so many thousands of people who are working in the network that Ian chairs, and I want to thank each and every one of them. They all know who they are because we see each other and we talk, but this is an unstoppable movement that's been created here. And yes, things are going to be tough in the months ahead of us, but the commitment to end rough sleeping is unshakable, and we will have things back on track following the interruptions of this year. So it's just a massive thank you. I mean, obviously our attention will turn to prevention coming out of this crisis and putting into place lots of the things we've learned from it. But I hope you've seen today a story of improvement, a show of complete commitment to what we're all doing, a partnership of equals between public, private, voluntary, community, faith. That is so important, and that underpins the Homelessness Action Network. And all of it, let me finish on this point, supported by the incredible generosity of the Greater Manchester public, who are always pushing us, challenging us, wanting us to do more here. Public who don't like to see any single fellow human being lying on our streets with nowhere to go. You know, that is the challenge they rightly set for us. We are rising to it, but there is more to be done, and we hope today's announcements will provide that bit more at this most challenging time. So thank you everybody for your questions and for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to Joe and Ian for everything they're doing and for being part of this, to Paul, as I've said, and I will close proceedings there. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.